According to the CDC, Lyme disease is the fastest growing insect-borne infectious illness in the United States. In fact, in the time it takes you to watch this show, 17 people will be diagnosed and potentially face a lifetime of physical, psychological, and economic suffering as a result. So here to discuss the growth of the disease and why it's largely ignored by the medical and scientific community is the CEO of LymeDisease.org, Lorriane Johnson. Thank you so much for coming on, Lorraine.
Thank you for having me.
So for those that don't know much about Lyme disease, can you first explain what it is, how it's contracted, and how many people we're talking about here that have it?
Well, Lyme disease is contracted through the bite of a tick. So if you're out hiking, you may be exposed to ticks. Ticks can transmit Lyme disease. They can transmit a number of other diseases at the same time. And the CDC has, until recently, said 30,000 people a year contract Lyme disease. Just this year, they revised their estimate to 300,000 people a year contracting Lyme disease. And just to put that in perspective, that's 6 times the annual rate of HIV/AIDS. So it's really quite a crisis right now.
What caused that extreme disparity in their previous reporting?
Well, their surveillance methods are really barriers to counting cases. They don't count laboratory tests straight out. They don't count physician diagnosis straight out. They have a number of steps that you have to go through in order to become a surveillance case. And it simply misses 9 out of 10 cases.
So let's talk about the CDC and the Infectious Disease Society of America, because according to them, Lyme disease just takes a month of antibiotics. It's not chronic. What do you say about that assessment?
Well, a lot of people do take a short course term of antibiotics and they're well, but about 36%, the estimates range from 20 to 36% of people remain ill. And the question, the controversy is, what do you do with those 36% of people who are still ill, unable to work? I mean, 25% of the people end up on disability, 42% have had to stop work. So it's not a minor illness, it's a very serious illness.
Project Censored, one of the leading research organizations in the country, basically said that Lyme disease was one of the most censored stories of 2011 because there's such a lack of kind of research data on this. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lack of research data in Lyme disease. There's actually a lot of research data, but it's just not at the treatment level. At the treatment level, there are only 2 main funding sources. One is the government funds research, and they've always said there were only 30,000 cases, so they haven't funded much research. They've only funded 4 trials. And the other main source of funding that you get for these high-level trials is the pharmaceutical industry. And they haven't had any interest in treatment because treatment is with generic antibiotics. It's not a moneymaker for them.
And let's talk about the vast array of diseases that Lyme is actually misdiagnosed for and what it can mimic.
Oh, it can mimic a number of diseases. It can mimic fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, depression, MS, ALS. And it's not clear that, all of these diseases are being misdiagnosed, but they have similar symptoms, and so it's easy to miss the diagnosis if you're not looking for it.
And the IDSA, guidelines hold an incredible amount of power, of course, in the medical community of how to treat Lyme. What can happen to doctors who choose to treat it like it's not that month-solving illness, that it is indeed chronic?
This is a real crisis. What happens is these guidelines are treated essentially as though they were regulations, but there's been no public input on them. And so what happens is if a physician goes outside of the guidelines, they might find themselves before a medical board with the risk of losing their medical license. So there's a very, the IDSA has been very aggressive about enforcing its guidelines, and when physicians step outside, they run the risk of losing their license.
Isn't there this huge differentiation between, 30% of people don't get cured from the antibiotics, but then these guidelines have very specific parameters for doctors. What happens to that kind of gray area?
Well, that's an interesting question, because ordinarily what medical guidelines will do if there's a gray area is they will provide treatment options. And in fact, the guidelines of the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society does provide treatment options. It says educate the patients, tell them what the risk is of continuing to treat or to not treat, and then make determinations based on the context of the individual patient.
You mentioned research and that there's a lot of it that isn't necessarily, sponsored by the government, of course, because as we know, they kind of are lacking the full story here. Talk about your personal experience with the peer review process.
We had an interesting experience with the peer review process. I have 40 publications that have been published in peer-reviewed medical journals. And one of the publications that we submitted, we've had trouble with a lot of publications, but one of the publications I submitted with Dr. Stricker, it went through a very rigorous peer review process, was accepted for publication, and then the editors told us they were going to send it over to the IDSA. So they send it over to the IDSA, and the next thing we know, we're being handed a completely revised manuscript. Doesn't bear any resemblance to what we said or what we would say, and we're told to take it or leave it. Well, we left it and we went to another medical journal where it was published. But those are the types of tactics that you see to sort of keep a lid and suppress people who hold opposing viewpoints.
What did they edit out?
Oh, they edited out information about the number of cases that remain uncured. They edited out information about what correct guidelines should look like, how you ought to take into account patient preferences, how you should be providing people with treatment options like we do in breast cancer. You know, we don't know what's best. Is it a lumpectomy or a mastectomy? It's your life. You get to make some choices there. So we pointed out things like that.
Interestingly enough, we called the CDC, and they actually said that you and your organization are spreading unscientific information. Just really interesting. How do you respond to this kind of smear campaign on behalf of this establishment?
Well, those are like personal attacks, and they're attempts to not engage in the issues. I mean, it's interesting because I've been involved in evidence-based medicine for the past 10 years, and with the Cochrane Association. I serve on the panels with PCORI, which is a patient-centered outcomes research institute, which was founded under the Affordable Care Act. So I'm very involved in evidence-based medicine. This dispute is not about evidence. This dispute is about, evidence-based medicine, opinions that are filling evidence gaps, and a failure to look at a lot of new emerging evidence because it doesn't fit pet research theories.
I mean, I think everyone, especially if you live in kind of a woodsy area, I know someone who's had Lyme disease that was misdiagnosed. I think everyone has this kind of shared experience. Obviously, this experience led you to pioneer this issue. How can we make sure that we are, getting the proper diagnosis, getting the proper treatment? Of course, what's your advice to people on how they can properly diagnose themselves if they potentially have Lyme? Well,
if somebody has been out hiking, if they've been exposed to ticks, and sometimes in the backyard, if you have deer in your backyard, you may be exposed to ticks, and those people ought to be very careful. They should be doing tick checks. If they find a tick, they should get the tick tested to see if it carries any infections, because these can carry up to 7 different infections. And then if they go in and get treated, if they're not well, they need to start seeking solutions, because this illness is very severe for many people.
Thank you so much, Lorriane Johnson, CEO at LymeDisease.org. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again.